ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa has acknowledged that coalition governments will be the order of the day. Coalition talks among South Africa's biggest parties and smaller ones are ongoing, with reports of negotiations pointing to a massive power shift in the country's biggest metros. To give us a sense of what coalitions mean for the current state of political affairs is election specialist Tselane. A very good morning to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I know these are the kind of conversations you've been having all week, and it must be quite fascinating for you, having seen some of your conversations unfold through the results. But let's first start with the conceptual idea of coalition governments and the role that they play. We've seen it gain steam here in South Africa. It's no longer undeniable, but there's also international best practice to learn from.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for having me here. If you look at the pattern in South Africa, in 2016 we had about 27 hung councils, which then required a coalition arrangement. And now, during these elections of 2021, we have about 66 councils that are hung councils. In other words, these are councils where you don't have an outright win. And therefore, political parties need to cooperate in order to be able to govern that kind of municipality. So the fact that in the country now, we no longer have one dominant party, it leads to a situation where we have got to now get various political parties to sit together in order to develop a program of action for that municipality.
But now, there is no one-size-fits-all in terms of structure, is there, of coalitions? I mean, we've seen some fail and some really thrive in various countries. Somebody was, I think it was the UDM leader, Bantu Olomisa, pointing out recently about the German coalition government and indeed how it came about, talking about how ideological differences need not mean that a coalition partnership may not work. What are the chances of that here in South Africa? How are we understanding it, given that it's very much in its early stages?
Well, in Germany, firstly, Western Europe as a whole have had coalitions since 1945, and Germany also for a long, long time. And this time around, the three major political parties are in negotiations to try to get a coalition arrangement together. They have established about 22 working groups, which are basically based on the key principles that they are agreeing to. So in each and every principle that they've agreed to, they are developing a program of action around it. Now, when you compare this with what we had in South Africa in 2016, you realize that in South Africa you had a very loose coalition or arrangement between the political parties. So that loose arrangement that we have, I colloquially refer to as a fat and sit arrangement, where there is no commitment and accountability, and that a party that is tired of the relationship can just pack and go the following day without necessarily having to account to any structure. Now, there is something we can learn also from Kenya. Kenya have established what they call the Register of Political Parties. And this Register of Political Parties, that's where political parties that enter into a coalition, they deposit the agreement. The agreements have got key principles as well as the protocols that have got to be followed in case there is conflict or there is a dispute between parties. So the Register of Political Parties then given the responsibility of having to assist the political parties with the resolution of their problems. But that coalition agreement that deposited with the register also contains a dispute resolution mechanism. So political parties can use that. And I've been suggesting that in South Africa, what we need to be doing is to basically develop a structure similar to CCMA, where you will have an agency managing the coalitions. This structure must be able to deal with the coalitions, conciliation, deal with the dispute through conciliation or arbitration. And if the dispute still persists even there after that, then they can be referred to the electoral court. So we've got to find a way of regulating this relationship so that it is not easy for political parties just to come in and out of relationship.
So that's what I wanted to find out. Would it be something that is legislated as in a blueprint for all parties, or would it be something that is dealt with on a case-by-case basis? Because not all coalitions are equal, and some may be envisaged to be short-term, some may have a long-term view. And how do you take out intra-party politics from it, from, politicizing service delivery, for instance? You have spoken about various country examples. Perhaps if you could use Lesotho and Botswana, where we've seen some of these incidents.
Those cases that you've quoted, there's Botswana and Lesotho, it is also areas where we don't have proper regulation of the relationship between political parties. Now, what I'm suggesting is something that is going to be applicable to every municipality that now finds itself where there is no outright winner. But also, I don't know whether you notice what is actually happening in the context of South Africa. If you look at these results, if these were provincial and national elections, clearly there was not going to be an outright winner at a national level as well as at provincial level. Now, as we move towards 2024, we've got to make sure that we have mechanisms in place, because this pattern is likely to reproduce itself for 2024 elections. So if we have a regulation of coalitions, that framework will also still be applicable, even at a provincial level or even at a national level, when we find ourselves in a situation where there is no outright win. The current arrangement where you don't have clear principles, no proper agreements, no clear program of action based on those principles, is the one that is actually leading to instability and making service delivery almost impossible, and then affecting, obviously, the majority of our people who look upon the structures that have been elected to provide basic services to those different areas where they live.
I mean, that point that you raise about new political settings, particularly here in South Africa, and I'd like to explore whether or not individual policies or even if it's individual policies within a party can affect how the trajectory of that coalition is then set out. Because I'm going to take the Free State, for instance. We were there as the SABC recently looking at some of the challenges of service delivery when it comes to electricity and water provision. The tender system, which is said to be favored by the governing party, has been rejected by other parties, saying that it makes it vulnerable for corruption to occur. So what I'm just trying to understand is that how do you negotiate that? Because something like that, you can't just simply legislate. You also have to bring in civil society to get their understanding of, if you were to have a framework, what would be the shortest way to achieving what you need, but also to satisfy both political parties' ambitions or all coalition party ambitions?
Well, the first thing is to agree on key principles and the protocols thereof. In other words, you're putting in place a dispute resolution mechanism, even in the short term. And the key principles that you are agreeing to, you then begin to create a program around those areas so that there are mechanisms where you are basically going to be able to measure whether you are making progress or not making progress. And if there are stumbling blocks, what to do in order to deal with those stumbling blocks that may arise. The issues of such as tender systems, those are the how. They are not the key principle that should actually be determining the relationship. That's how the services will be delivered to communities. So political parties, after having agreed to key principles, can then agree on how or the mechanisms that are going to be employing in order to be able to achieve those key principles that they would have agreed to.
So let's talk about principles and perhaps talk about values in the same token. We've seen some of the political parties, the big political parties, saying that they're not willing to get into coalition governments with the other contesting parties, and which are possibly the more plausible ones, because those are the ones with the greatest number of seats, and they've used principles as the reason for it. Now, for the electorate, how are they supposed to understand that? If we're to argue, for instance, that most of the manifestos of political parties are pretty much the same, but they will argue that they can't get into bed with the next party because of principles. I mean, virtue is one thing, but how do we as the electorate know that, they're not just playing around with words, that there is something tangible when they talk about those principles?
Yeah, political parties have got to obviously reach the maturity where they can be able to talk to each other and then begin to understand that the negotiations entails give and take. So even if you are insistent on particular aspects, you've got to take in consideration some of the aspects that you think would actually be able to benefit your constituents. And I think all the political parties, because they've been elected by particular constituencies, they would want to service those constituencies. They would want to be able to, they would want their constituency to derive benefits of having come into some kind of relationship or having come into power. So it is those key areas that they must focus on. Trying to focus on areas that basically creates division amongst political parties is not going to be helpful. But I believe that also that, as they go into these negotiations, some political parties will come with principles that they regard as non-negotiable. But as time goes on, they will begin to be practical and begin to say, these are some of the things that needs to be done in order to be able to benefit our own constituencies. So not every political party will get what they want, but they will have to firstly think about whether whatever agreement they enter into, it will benefit their constituencies.
Share with me your thoughts on this, Terry. Some political parties have, like the EFF, said they'd rather, including the DA, in fact, I've heard them say that they'd rather shun political power and be backbenchers than to be in bed, quote unquote, with people who are at odds with their ultimate goals. But the ultimate goals, like the EFF has said, is to be in governance. So has the DA said that. So it seems like a contradiction in terms. So when do political parties know when to form coalitions and why? Because you can say you're shunning expediency in order to promote service delivery, but aren't they all ultimately seeking to have their hands on the lever of power?
Well, the fact that there are negotiations after the elections have taken place clearly illustrate the fact that a party is not able to govern on its own, and therefore even insisting on governing on your own would not necessarily be able to yield the necessary results. So it would mean that the political parties would have to work together, and coalitions basically means co-governance. They may still be able to agree on a particular party getting a particular position or mayoral position in another area, etc., etc. But as I have indicated, key issues is not even about a position. That one it's a given, in the sense that we are talking about a core governance. It means parties to the agreement will have to work together. They will have to have structures which are reflective of both of partners into the agreement. But that's not the only thing. The most important thing is going to be those key principles that are going to be agreed with, because the key principles that are agreeing to are the principles that are now going to be about delivery of services to the constituencies that have elected them.
So just finally, just talking about coalition behavior, if we are to develop a blueprint, what should it not be? And does it have the potential to influence multi-level governance, as in somehow influence the parliamentary system?
It will definitely influence the parliamentary system, as I've suggested to you, that the base of one dominant party in South Africa have becoming extinct. So political parties have got to work together in order to be able to govern. But also, I think something that is important to realize is also that proportional representation system, which is our system, because the Constitution determined that our system must result in general in proportionality, does lead to a situation of co-governance, where particularly there is no one dominant party. And the fact that we've had one dominant party over the years has actually been an anomaly. So now that we have now moved into this terrain of now hung councils, whatever we do at the municipal level will have implications for provinces where you will not have one outright winner, or even at the national level. So the system that they put in place must be durable, must be a structure that of a framework that can actually be able to accommodate whatever eventuality that will arise in 2024.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. Terry Tselane is an electoral specialist.